So I'm Jentzen Mehl. If you haven't met me, I would love to meet you and get to know you better. Kirsten and I have been coming to this church for a little over a year now, and we've been very blessed with this community and getting to know all of you. So like I said, if I don't know you, I'd love to get to know you better and just kind of grow in that relationship with you. And thank you so much to Deborah and the women's group here for inviting me and hosting me to do this presentation. I really hope that it's impactful to all of you. Also, I'm just on the tail end of recovering from a sickness, so if I end up clearing my throat or take a drink of water, please just bear with me. Okay, so a little bit of background of me. Ethan, if you want to change the slide, thank you. So I went to Grace Christian University. I got my bachelor's degree in biblical studies with an emphasis on the Old Testament. So although it was a biblical studies degree, it was also very much a history degree, as it was the history of the people of Israel moving from Egypt into the Promised Land and then establishing themselves as a nation. I had an emphasis on the Old Testament, as I said. With that, there was the requirement of me taking 2 semesters of Hebrew and 2 semesters of Greek. I ended up falling in love with languages, and I took 3 semesters of Hebrew and 6 semesters of Greek to land with 27 credits in biblical languages. Because of that, I ended up getting the job at Manuscript Research Group, which was in Spring Lake, Michigan. I was actually in Spring Lake at the same time that Pastor Adam was there in Spring Lake, working at the church Harvest. And I got that job because they were looking for anyone in the Grand Rapids area who was studying Hebrew. And then I believe I got the job. Out of the 3 of us that interviewed, I was also studying Greek. So I kind of was in both languages and ended up getting the job as a manuscript analyst. And that's how I ended up learning about these scrolls and acquiring both of these scrolls, which I'll get into that more. I'm currently at Wheaton College in their Biblical Exegesis Master's Program. To exegete is a Greek word. It means to draw out, opposed to eisege, which would be to put ourselves in. So the program is really about not putting myself or ourself, our culture, onto the scriptures, but drawing out the original meaning of the scriptures. And the program has a very heavy focus on the languages Greek and Hebrew. So first, let's just talk about what is a Torah, which is here on my left is the Torah, and on my right I have an Esther scroll. Also, I'm going to pass this around. This is not a biblical manuscript. This is just something that a scribe has written. They would write these as they would practice before they sat down to actually write any form of biblical manuscript. So I'm going to pass this around. If you don't mind just passing it to the person next to you, you can take a look at it. And at the end, you'll end up coming up and you'll be able to look at the scrolls themselves. But one thing I want to point out about this manuscript as it's going around, again, it's not biblical, so don't worry about it. Just please don't tear it in half. It has a lot of markings in between the lines of the Hebrew language, and that you're seeing is vowels. As you come up to the scrolls and the manuscripts, the biblical manuscripts, they do not have vowels in them. So that would be a difference between just regular Hebrew writing and then the biblical manuscripts. The biblical manuscripts never have vowels or any kind of markings on them. Okay, so to begin talking about what a Torah is. A Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament written in Hebrew. So it's Genesis through Deuteronomy. This scroll that's here on my left, on your guys' right side, this one is 180 feet long. I have it open about 12 feet. It's open to Exodus, and I have Exodus 15 showing and Exodus 20 showing. The reason why I chose to have it open to Exodus is because there are 5 specially formatted passages within the Torah, and 2 of them sit in Exodus. That's open here on the table. That's Exodus 15, the crossing of the Red Sea, and Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments. So it's written in Hebrew. It goes from right to left. The Hebrew language goes from right to left. And as you approach these, you are standing at the bottom. So you would read it right to left, top to bottom, like we read English. A Torah, or all the biblical manuscripts, are made from all things kosher. Now, when I say that, most of the time people think that all the biblical scrolls are made from lamb, But actually, there are a lot more animals than a lamb that can be considered kosher. So a kosher animal is an animal that feeds off grass, and there are more criteria besides just feeding off grass. Like they can't have the cleft hoof, and there are other laws in the book of Leviticus and in the Talmud that restrain for what kind of animals that can be used. But a cow, a horse, a lamb, a goat, a donkey, all of these animals could be used as to be made into a biblical manuscript. However, they wouldn't have used something like a horse because horses were so valuable. So oftentimes, the hide or the parchment, the skin of the manuscript, is made from a sheep or a goat or a lamb. And the scroll that's here on my left, the material is called gavil, which is a Hebrew word, and it stands for the full leather. Basically, just the fur was scraped off of this, whereas on my right, the Esther scroll, plus the manuscript that's being passed around, this material is called cloth, another Hebrew word, and that just stands for the innermost layer of the skin. So 1-2 layers of the skin. So this is very much scroll-like. If I were to take these bean bags off, it would roll up into a scroll. Whereas the Torah, the gavil leather, it's very much like a blanket, so to speak. It stays open. I could drape it over my arm, and it would just lay over my arm. So I have the two different types of materials that biblical manuscripts are written on. And again, this is Old Testament Hebrew manuscripts, whereas New Testament manuscripts are written on papyrus, which is plants woven together. Both of these scrolls, but we're focusing on the Torah right now, used in a synagogue. Many don't know this, but a synagogue is a Jewish house of worship or a Jewish church. And the synagogues have a calendar to make sure that they go through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, within a full year. And all the synagogues across the world are reading from the same passage of the Torah every Friday night at Sabbath. So if you went to the synagogue here in Traverse City on Friday night, and then you went to one in Asia, it would be the next passage that is being read. So they stand united universally like that, which is pretty cool. But as a congregation, they read through the Torah once a year. The rest of the books of the Old Testament are paired with the Torah. It's called a Haftarah. And that's not half Torah, like H-A-L-F. It's Haftarah, which is also a Hebrew word, but it stands for the Old Testament written in Hebrew, which is not the Torah, not the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And they pair those readings from the Haftarah with the Torah each Sabbath in the synagogues to make sure that they go through the entire Bible throughout the year. And again, they stand on the same universal calendar of the readings so that no matter which Torah you're visiting throughout the world, you get through the whole Torah and the whole Old Testament. To continue talking about all things kosher, it's not just the skin that makes the parchment that this manuscript is written on. Also, the panels here, which you'll see as you get closer, are sewn together by the tendons and ligaments of that kosher animal that they slayed to make the manuscript. Then the staves, or the pieces of wood that they tied the ends of the manuscripts on, are also made from a kosher tree. Now, again, they have rules to what makes a tree kosher, just like they do with what makes an animal kosher. But all parts of the Torah have to be kosher for it to be used in a synagogue as an instrument to worship God. Even the ink is considered kosher. And even the scribe who wrote with said ink is considered to be in a state of kosher as he was doing the writing. And the scribes, when they wrote these manuscripts, they would have wrote with a feather from a kosher bird, and the ink is made from a gall nut. So if you've ever seen a tree that has a weird lump on the side of it, probably after this presentation you'll notice some more, but they're all over even here in Michigan, that is called a gall nut. And that happens when a wasp or some kind of bee stings the tree, and the tree, as a result of pushing out the venom, it forms this gall nut. Now, the Jewish community would break off these gall nuts. They would smash up the inside of it with a pestle, like a pestle and mortar. They would add some water and maybe some other materials to make the ink that they would then use a feather to write with under candlelight. Now, Torahs generally would take about 1 year of a scribe working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, would probably take him about a year to write a full Torah. And a lot of scribes in the Jewish community, it is their honor and their life's work or their life aspiration to write one Torah in their lifetime. They graduate up to writing a Torah. They start with, like the manuscript that's being passed around, into something like an Esther scroll, which they could write an Esther scroll probably between 1 day and 1 week, depending on how fast they were writing. And then they graduate up to writing a Torah. Torahs are still being made today. A lot of people don't think that, but Torahs are being made today in Israel. There are scribes working on it. If you've ever been to the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., they have a Jewish scribe there who is writing a Torah. Apparently, I've never been there, but apparently you can go up to his station and get your name written in Hebrew for a tip or whatever. But Torahs are still being produced. So a lot of times when people think of a Torah, they think of some kind of ancient antiquity, but that's not the case. This one that's here is, and we'll get into that, but there are Torahs being produced today, probably all over the world. Some synonyms for a Torah. Torah is a Hebrew word, which means law, but then we have the Greek word Pentateuch, and then some synonyms that you'll find in your Bible, which is referencing the Torah, would be the law of Moses, or the Mosaic law. And that's because Moses is attributed with the authorship of the original Torah. Although in the end of Deuteronomy, the end of the Torah, it does document Moses' death. So many scribes would say that Joshua then penned to finish the Torah, writing down Moses' death. So I'd like to talk about what is known as the Tetragrammaton, and this is the name of Yahweh. The name Yahweh is made up of 4 consonants. Starting from the right, the little one that looks like an apostrophe, that is a yod. Then we have a he, then a vav, and a he. Now, if I were to say those slowly, yod, he, vav, he, it even sounds like Yahweh. The original, it's referred to as the Tetragrammaton, tetra for 4, and grammaton for consonants. And the original Tetragrammaton was written with no vowels. Vowels were added later on as scribes speculated what the name of God sounded like. But I just want that to sink in, that Yod, He, Vav, He. As I speak that out, I have to pronounce the consonant He twice, which in English is transliterated to our English H. Now, when you pronounce H, you have to have an exhale out of your mouth, H, and you have a release of breath, which is meant to resemble the breath that was breathed into Adam's nostrils to give him life. And as we breathe, we are reminded that God gives us the breath that we breathe each day to keep us alive. Something that we find in the Old Testament that resembles this breathing and this letter H is when Sarai is renamed Sarah and Abram is renamed Abraham. Both of them receive an H into their name, which is meant to signify God's presence within their lives. And whenever we have Yahweh, or the Tetragrammaton, appears in your Old Testament, it is translated in all uppercase, Lord. Whereas we see the word Lord all the time in the New Testament. And if it is capitalized, it is referencing Yahweh. And if it just has a capital L, it is just the word Lord. If the L is not even capitalized, it's probably just referencing a king or some kind of ruler. Okay? So to talk specifically about this Torah and what makes it unique, it is called a Yemenite Torah because it was written in Yemen. Now, it's dated to early 1800s, somewhere between 1800 and 1810, written in Yemen, as I said, and how I acquired it. When I was working at Manuscript Research Group, we got a lot of our manuscripts from auctions that were taking place in Israel. Because of who I was working for, Dr. Scott Carroll and his collection, we were invited into these auctions, which were online. And you had to be invited in. It was a very niche group. The guy who held the gavel and banged it, he was a Jewish man with the swirly tassels of hair, and wearing the whole Jewish getup. This Torah came up for auction, and no one was bidding on it, and I decided to bid on it. And I remember when I placed a bid for this Torah, the man on the screen, he leaned forward because he saw that I was from Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's like, what? But he still hit the gavel and sold it to me, and it was shipped all the way to Spring Lake, Michigan from Israel. But it was originally written in Yemen. So I want to talk about how it went from Yemen to being sold in Israel. So in 1951, there was a Yemenite genocide. So, all of the Jews in Yemen were being heavily persecuted, synagogues were being burned to the ground, and all biblical manuscripts were being burned and destroyed. Now, the Israeli Defense Force found out that this was taking place, and under Operation Magic Carpet, they flew all the remaining Jews out of Yemen along with their biblical manuscripts to Israel. So it is believed that this scroll would have been on one of those helicopters being flown from Yemen to Israel in this operation to save the Jews and their manuscripts. Now, something cool about the Yemenite community is there is no longer one in Yemen. After the Yemenite genocide, there is no longer an active synagogue in the country of Yemen. And before the genocide took place, Yemen is kind of in the middle of Africa, off the coast, and it's quite a distance from Israel if we were to look at them on a map. And between the time, while Israel was taken over by the Muslims, they also conquered a lot of the land between Israel and Yemen, northern Africa, and so on and so forth. Yemen as a country and a Jewish community, they completely lost contact with Israel when Israel was not a nation. So the Yemenite community actually thought that they were one of the last Jewish communities on the planet. And because of that, when they broke the gall nuts off of trees to make the ink, before they actually started writing the ink, they used some kind of red dye to dye the face of the parchment, which you'll see on some of the panels as you come up here and look at it. And that act of dyeing the face of the Torah red was an act of mourning the bloodshed of the Jews across the world. So only Yemenite Torahs have the red dyed panels or the red face. And that was one way that I was able to authenticate this one as being from Yemen. And it's also one that makes the Yemenite Torahs pretty unique. So in the biblical manuscript world, having a manuscript that was written pre-Holocaust usually makes it more valuable and makes it more of an antiquity, more of a sought-after product. But to have a Torah that not only survived the Holocaust, but also survived the Yemenite genocide makes this Torah kind of a double survivor, so to speak. So it's pretty cool. And there are no longer Torahs being produced in Yemen. So I'm very thankful to have it. Now, I would have not been able to obtain either of these manuscripts if they were not pasul. Now, pasul is a Hebrew word which means unclean. Much like how I was talking about the word kosher, which is also a Hebrew word which means clean. These manuscripts would not be in my possession if they were kosher. If they were kosher, they would still be getting used in a synagogue to worship God. So once a biblical manuscript falls out of the state of kosher, there are then criteria or rules that the Jewish community has to do to deal with those manuscripts. Some of these can be found in the book of Leviticus, some of them can be found in the Talmud, some of them can be found in other locations. Excuse me. But this Torah itself is pasul because, which I don't have it open to, but it's missing a large chunk of text. There was kind of maybe about this large of a piece from the bottom up to the top that is missing as it took damage. So some of the scripture is missing out of the Torah. Now, if even one word is missing from a biblical manuscript, it is deemed pasul, no longer kosher, no longer clean. And that would even include if some of the ink has flaked off to make one word illegible, then it's no longer kosher and cannot be used anymore in a synagogue as an instrument of worship. So this Torah is pasul because it's missing part of the text. Same with the Esther Scroll. It's also missing part of the text as it took fire damage, but I will get into that. So that was the left, the Torah. Here on my right, or your guys' left, I have an Esther Scroll. Now, it's referred to as a Polish Esther Scroll because it was written in Poland. I acquired it on eBay. Someone's great-grandchild who had it in their family posted it on eBay to sell. And looking at it right away from the pictures that they had there on eBay, I knew that it was an authentic Esther Scroll because of the specially formatted passage, the sons of Haman. And as you come up to the scroll, one of the 11 columns looks very unique, and that is the sons of Haman. Because in the book of Esther, Haman and all of his sons are hung for Haman's crimes. I have seen in the past Esther Scrolls that are embellished and illuminated, and they literally have stick figures drawn in that column of men hanging just to even spice it up a little bit more. It's also written in Hebrew. All of the biblical manuscripts of the Old Testament are written in Hebrew. Now, the Torah, as I went through the material gevil, the full leather, the Esther Scroll is cloth, or the innermost layer of the skin, 1 to 2 layers of the skin. And as you will see when you come up, the far left column, the 11th column, it is missing part of the text because when the scroll was rolled up, it took fire damage. It's very clear that the scroll caught fire on one of the ends and it started to burn its way down. They put the fire out, but not fast enough because the scroll is missing part of the text. And again, if even one word is missing from the scroll, it is no longer kosher, is now pasul, and can no longer be used. Now, both of these manuscripts could have been restored. They could have paid a scribe to create some kind of patch and rewrite the missing text. However, it's not very expensive for them to just commission a scribe to write a whole new manuscript. So it'd probably been about the same cost to have a whole new Esther Scroll written that it would have taken for the scribe to restore the Esther Scroll. And usually the Jewish community feels differently than we do about these things. I feel like this is quite an antiquity, an authentic book of Esther written on a scroll in Hebrew. I love it, but the Jewish community would rather just have a shiny new one. So they gave this, to obviously a member of that synagogue who held on to it until their grandchild or great-grandchild didn't want it anymore and just sold it on eBay. So I picked that up and it was shipped right to my house from Poland. Pretty cool. Also dated for the 1900s, so it itself is a Holocaust survivor. Okay, so I want to spend some time talking about the development of the canon, how we got to the 66 books that stand within our Protestant Bibles. So basically, after the New Testament ends, there is some other biblical literature that talks about what was going on, such as the Epistle of Barnabas, who's all over in the New Testament, traveling around with Paul. There are other epistles and authors that wrote in Greek and talked about what happened after the book of Acts, so to speak. But people were heavily debating certain ideas, one being the divinity of Christ, one being the Trinity. Some of these larger theological things, councils began to meet together to debate these things and talk about which of these manuscripts, which of these letters, which ones talk about these things, which ones are biblically inspired or Holy Spirit inspired, which ones should we put together to form the Bible, form the canon. Now, there were lots of laws and rules that these councils wrote down to deem whether a book could be canonical or not. One of them is that if the book claims I wrote this, like sometimes we see in Paul's letters, I, Paul, am writing to you from wherever. That would be Paul claiming that he himself wrote this letter. If at any time that is proven to not be true, it is no longer canonical. So one of the laws or rules is that it has to be full truth. Everything that you find in it has to be proven as true. So if someone is claiming that they wrote it, but that ends up being proven that they didn't write it, that book can no longer be canonical. One book that this happened to would be the Book of Enoch. So if you've read the Book of Enoch, in the introduction it says, I, Enoch, ... Well, Enoch used to sit as a canonical book. But they then later proved that Enoch himself did not write the Book of Enoch. And when they found that out, the Book of Enoch could no longer be canonical, and it did get removed from the canon. Now, the country of Ethiopia has held every single book that was ever deemed as canon within their Bible. So the Ethiopian Bible has a total of 86 books, which includes the Apocrypha and the Book of Enoch. The Catholic Bible holds more books than we do. I believe it's an additional 12 books. If you wanted to find that as a Protestant Christian, there's a book called the Apocrypha, which holds the additional 12 books that the Catholic Bible holds over our Protestant Bible. And again, when we had the Reformation, or the division from Catholic to Protestant Christian, the Protestant Christian community formed their own canon, their own Bible, and some of the books that we find in the Apocrypha or in the Catholic Bible did not make their way into the Bible that we have, such as the Book of Wisdom, the Book of Tobit, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which document the Maccabean revolt of the Jews revolting against Rome. So, yeah, I'm kind of starting to go off on a rabbit trail. But anyways, so these councils that you see here started to form. And the first one was the Council of Nicaea, as they began to debate, the divinity of Christ, the Trinity. What is the Trinity? How do we talk about the Trinity? And all kinds of matters theology. And one thing I want to say as I'm going through this slide is it's very difficult because we're talking 1,700 years that I've tried to condense into one slide up here to talk about. There were other councils that met besides the ones that I have on the screen, but these were the main ones that really got a lot done, so to speak, really made definitive claims or definitive rules as to what is canon or what is theology, such as what is the Trinity, what is the Holy Spirit and his acting within the biblical manuscripts and within our lives today. So a lot of these councils met in the 300s of AD, as in the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Rome, the Synod of Hippo, and the Council of Carthage. Then we had some time pass, but the Protestant Reformation took place from 1517 to 1648 AD. And during that time was when they finally came to a conclusion that 39 books are to be canon of the Old Testament. So we went several years between the Council of Carthage to the Protestant Reformation of finally determining what is a canon Old Testament, and that is to be the 39 books that you find from Genesis to Malachi. Then, we also had the Council of Trent meet from 1545 to 1563 to determine 46 books to be canon of the Old Testament, which included the Apocrypha, the Catholic books, as I talked about. And then in 1672 was when you had the New Testament canon finally be formed at the Synod of Jerusalem, where they settled for the 27 books of the New Testament to be deemed as canon. And I know that that was a lot. We have a historian here in the room. Hopefully he doesn't judge me too hard on that quick overview of 2,000 years. Thank you. Now, something that is kind of more of my specialty would be the evolution of the language of the Bible. So, many know Moses right after the exodus of leaving Egypt, while he's in the desert with the Hebrew people, climbs up Mount Sinai and receives the 2 stone tablets of the 10 Commandments written in Hebrew. Now, also stated in that story, this is happening when the golden calf is happening. So the people are like, Moses, he's gone. He's been gone for 40 days. He's gone. We're never going to see him again. We're going to build our own God. We're going to build the golden calf, and we're going to start worshiping it. As Moses is coming down from the mountain, which he spent 40 days up there to get these 2 stone tablets, he breaks the 2 stone tablets in anger, and he has to turn around and go back up for another 40 days. Interestingly, in that story, he does come all the way down the mountain, and he grinds up the golden calf and makes the Hebrew people drink it. Highly encourage you to read that story if you missed that point. It's very fascinating. But he turns around, climbs back up, and gets a second copy of the 2 stone tablets from the top of Mount Sinai. So as we discussed, Moses is attributed with writing the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, kind of a evolution of these 2 stone tablets, or the 10 Commandments, given to him on the top of Mount Sinai. Although Moses is far later in life from the creation story that we find in Genesis, there's something that is talked about a lot in the biblical studies community, and that's oral tradition or oral gospels or oral messages that were going around. So often in the biblical studies community, we reference the oral gospel of Peter, because Peter never wrote down a gospel himself, but his words and his sermons make their way into the Gospel of Mark and Luke and Matthew, and probably the Gospel of John. So even though there is no Gospel of Peter, we often reference the oral Gospel of Peter and how that probably would have had an impact on each of the Gospel authors writing their Gospel. I bring that up because there would have been the oral tradition and the oral creation story going around during the time of Moses about the patriarchs of the Old Testament. And some of those stories that we find in the beginning chapters of Genesis, like the flood, the story of Noah and the flood, the Tower of Babel found in Genesis 11. These would have been oral stories that were going around. And many would say, and I believe, that the Holy Spirit also inspired Moses to recall the creation story to be able to pen it to paper in the book of Genesis as he was writing the Torah. Who knows? Maybe as he was on Mount Sinai, God told him. Then the Torah itself was fully completed and compiled and put together in a scroll during the time of Ezra in 458 BC. Ezra and Nehemiah, as you're reading the Old Testament, they helped rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. After King Cyrus of Persia came out with the Cyrus decree and allowed the Jews to go back to their hometown and worship their own gods and take anything that was taken from them when Israel was taken over by Assyria and then Babylon. Then Babylon's taken over by Persia, and King Cyrus writes the Cyrus decree, allows the people to go back to their town. Ezra and Nehemiah were a part of that coming back to the promised land from the north, from Babylon, which was then taken over by Persia. And they are attributed with rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. Now, Ezra himself was a part of the line of high priests, and he was quite the scholar. He studied the word himself all the way through his time in exile. And he is the one who's attributed with putting together the Mosaic Law, kind of actually putting it into a scroll form and making it the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Sorry, I need a drink. Okay, so the Tanakh, which is a Hebrew word, refers to the Old Testament written in Hebrew. The Tanakh was compiled from the 2nd century BC through to the 2nd century AD. And I know that that's 400 years, but it took some time, like we talked about, of the process of developing what is canon and what is not canon, and the process of putting these books together to make one concisive book, the Old Testament. Then, so we're still in Hebrew here with the 2 stone tablets, with the Torah, with the compiling of the Old Testament, the Tanakh. Then we have the Septuagint, which is it's a Greek word for the Greek Old Testament. And that was produced between 3rd century and 1st century BC. So obviously, while they were compiling the Old Testament and putting it together, the Hebrew Old Testament, they were also translating it into Greek. Now, during this time, Alexander the Great has gone through and Hellenized the world. That term Hellenized is because the word Ellenika is Greek. So it's not, Hellenized is not like making the world hell, it means making the world Greek. Alexander the Great wanted the whole world to be united under the Greek language. So while they were compiling the Hebrew Old Testament, they were also translating it into Greek and making the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. Interesting fact would be that every single time in your New Testament that the Old Testament is quoted, they are quoting the Septuagint. Now, I don't want you to think that the Greek Old Testament is more divinely inspired or better than the Hebrew Old Testament. I believe that was just a simple case of the world being Greek, the world speaking Greek altogether. So some of these people who were writing the New Testament in Greek, when they wanted to quote the Old Testament, they would have gone to a Greek source of the Old Testament to quote. Okay, so then we have St. Jerome, who translated into Latin the Latin Vulgate from 380 to 405 BC. The Latin Vulgate held as the go-to Bible, so to speak, for many, many years. And there was many years that the Catholic Church allowed Bibles to only be in Latin. So people would be persecuted for having a Bible that was not in Latin. And when we started to have people come around, such as William Tyndale, who wanted to translate that Bible from Latin to English, he himself was heavily, heavily persecuted by the Catholic Church for trying to produce a Bible that was not Latin or not the Latin Vulgate. Nonetheless, he did anyways, and he produced the Geneva Bible in 1560 AD. He was heavily persecuted for this. He reminds me of King David, who was running from Saul. William Tyndale was kind of on the run and on the hunt, and he was kind of hiding out, translating the Bible from Latin to English. Also something that I skipped over is St. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin. He went to Jerusalem and studied Hebrew and Greek for 3 years before he came back and translated those into Latin. So, just an interesting note. Then William Tyndale produced the Geneva Bible in 1560 AD. And then King James himself in Europe wanted a production of the King James Bible. So he had the King James Bible produced in 1611 AD. And then from the Geneva Bible and the King James Bible, we have all of the English translations that we have today. Now, something I want to talk about is that the modern world is going through great lengths to produce very, very sound English translations. So if the Bible that you currently have, whether that be NIV or ESV, NASB, whatever version it is, there are probably newer editions of that version of the word coming out, and that is because the council that meets to discuss a more accurate translation is finding ways to produce a more accurate translation, so then they thus produce a whole new Bible. That's not a money grab, it's simply a more accurate translation. So these councils that meet today, the NIV has Zondervan and their council of translators, the ESV has Crossway. These councils are made up of at least 20 people who are sitting in a room debating how to translate said Hebrew word or said Greek word, and they really, really dive into it. You can find videos on YouTube of them talking about very, very specific words. In my program at Wheaton, we watched one of these videos about translating the Greek word doulos, which is translated into, doulos in Greek means slave or servant. And in like the Geneva Bible and the King James Bible, Doulos is translated as slave. A lot of Paul's letters, he opens with like, I, Paul, a slave of Christ. And then we're starting to see that word now being produced in our English Bibles as servant. I, Paul, a servant of Christ. The reason why is because of the way that that word would have been taken in its time is of great importance. So when Paul says, I am a slave of Christ, that would have impacted the people during Paul's time differently than it impacts us at our time. And a more accurate translation of what Paul meant in today's era would be servant. Interestingly, we talked a lot in my class about how two different people would interpret that phrase, whether being white or black, and how they would feel about being a slave for Christ and what that would look like, and the thus need for doulos to be translated as servant in our modern times. So how do we respond to all this information? What do we do with this? I believe we are called to communicate with God through his scriptures. I have 4 or 5 passages here that I would really encourage you to take a look at and read on your own. These passages have all greatly impacted me, and I just recently spoke a message called Eating the Word, which contained all of these passages. But in Ezekiel 2:8 through 3:4 and Revelation 11, Ezekiel and John, these two stories are very, very similar in the sense that they are both given a scroll from heaven to eat. Now, there are more things about these two passages that make them kind of tied together. They are both in exile. Ezekiel is in exile up in Babylon. John, who writes Revelation, is in exile on the island of Patmos. They both have a vision of heaven. In the vision, both of them are given a scroll to eat. And then both of them, after they eat the scroll, are told to go and speak to the people of God. In Psalm 1, you will find that those who meditate on the word of God are blessed. Psalm 119 is a fascinating, fascinating passage. It is the longest chapter within the Bible, and every single verse is about the word of God, whether it's referring to it as a statute or a law or the word. Every single verse talks about the Bible itself. And then in the first chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus himself is identified as the Word of God that became incarnate and walked among us. So I would highly encourage you to read these passages yourselves. Now, I'm going to take questions, but while we're taking questions, I want you guys, if you want, to come on up and take a look at the scrolls. You can touch the scrolls, just please don't touch the ink because the ink flakes off very easily. But feel free to touch the scrolls, touch the bottom, touch around the ink. Feel the difference between the gavil, the full hide, and the cloth, the innermost layer. And please no drinks near the manuscripts. Please just be careful with them, but I would love it if you touch them. If you ever see one, in a museum, it'll be behind glass, and they'll tell you you can't touch it, but they just don't want these manuscripts to get damaged. Actually, the oils on your hands are very, very good for these manuscripts because they're made of skin, so have at it. I don't know if we want to go row by row or however that would work. Ben, maybe you would have row by row. Okay, yeah, if this first row wants to go, come on up and take a look. I'll move this over so you can do your thing. And does anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
When you were talking earlier about having part of them, like pasul,
Yeah.
parts missing, that they could have them restored,
Yeah.
would they then become unpasul?
That's a great question. So his question was, when a manuscript goes from kosher to pasul and it can be restored, can it get back to a place of kosher? And the answer is yes. As you come up to the Torah, you will see all kinds of corrections where they would do just that. They would make a scroll they would bring it back into the kosher state. Now, one of the ways that they could do this is if there was missing text, they could make a patch, so to speak. So they would again use skin from a kosher animal, and they would glue a patch onto the back. They kind of cut out the missing text, and they would glue a patch onto the back, and then they would rewrite the word. And then if the scroll, and as long as that whole process was done in a kosher way, so still using kosher materials, still using a scribe, still using the kosher ink and the feather and all of that, then the scroll would be enter back into a state of kosher. Sorry, it's a little chaotic up here. Cool. Sorry. Hey, couldn't see ya.
You had mentioned that the scribes, the people who wrote them, is that the correct word?
Mm-hmm.
They wrote these, it was an honor for them. But did they get paid to do this? If they did it for a whole year, were they?
That's a great question, one that I don't entirely know the answer to. But something that I do want to talk about is in the beginning, this would have been a Levite. And as we learn about the Levites in the Old Testament, there was actually 13 tribes of Judah. We often hear 12 tribes of Judah, but there was also the 13th tribe, Levi. And, excuse me, I'm just going to get out of these people's way. No, the tribe of Levi was scattered amongst the other 12 tribes of Judah, and they were deemed with all of the high priest duties, such as writing biblical manuscripts. And the Levites received all of the tithes and offerings, right? So when someone would come to the temple and they would sacrifice a lamb, that lamb would then be given to the tribe of Levi. So they were being taken care of in ways like that. So they weren't being paid in denarii or whatever, but they were still being given clothing and food, and a lot of that came from the offerings that were brought to the temples. Yeah. As, the world evolved, I'm sure that scribes are paid, and scribes today are definitely paid to write. Yeah. Like I said, there's a scribe at the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., who is being paid to write a Torah, and I imagine that the scribes in Israel today are being paid as they are commissioned to write scrolls.
Are they being written on?
Yes. The Torahs that are being produced today are being written on kosher animal skin still. They still hold to that tradition. Yes. If it was not written on a kosher animal skin, it would not be a biblical manuscript, or at least not a Hebrew Old Testament biblical manuscript. Yeah. So we'll get to you in just a second, okay? Go ahead.
Can you speak to the rituals that the scribes would
Yes.
do before they would write the scrolls?
Yes.
I love this part.
Thank you, Adam. So one thing that I've heard is that if a scribe messed up in writing the tetragrammaton, the name of Yahweh, the whole scroll would be thrown out. Now, I heard that's incorrect, though, so don't ooh and ah on that, because I heard that before I ever started working at Manuscript Research Group, when I was just an Old Testament major at Grace Christian University, but that is not true. I have seen many, many times when the word Yahweh, there was a mistake on it, and they either did an old school eraser and rewrote it, or they cut it out with a patch and had a patch done and they rewrote the name. But I do want to talk about, as Adam brought up, the kind of religious steps that scribes would go through to get into the state to write. So in Leviticus 19, we see the Day of Atonement and the steps that a high priest would go through as he entered into the tabernacles to sacrifice for the people of Israel. And there was a religious custom for the scribes before they sat down to write. Now, it looks different in each Jewish community. Some of them entered into a long, devout state of prayer. There was always some way that they connected with God and got themselves right before God, and a way that they ceremonially washed themselves, whether that would be like a ceremonial hand washing, or whether that would be like a full immersion of water, or so on and so forth, the scribes would go through a ceremonial ritual of connecting with God in prayer and then getting themselves right with a ceremonial washing. Okay, does that answer your question?
Before each session.
Yes, before each session. So if they set out to write 5 days a week, they would go through that process of prayer and washing before they began writing each day. And even if they would also do this when they got back from lunch. So it'd actually be even more than once a day. It would be before each session of sitting down and writing. So when they get up to go eat lunch and come back, they had to go through that ceremonial process again before they began writing again. Okay, we had a question, and I believe she's up now. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did, but there was somebody, like I said, there's people always challenging history, and they said, oh, that Council of Nicaea is just a bunch of men that got together. Can you give us some argument to dispute that? Have you heard anybody that just had brought up this type of thing? I think somebody wrote a book. His name was Brown, and I can't remember the name of the book. Help me out here if somebody remembers that. It's falling on deaf ears. Okay.
Yeah, so that's a good question. She's asking about the authenticity of these councils that formed, such as the Council of Nicaea or the Council of Trent. And unfortunately, I don't really have an answer to that. I just know that these councils were far more than 20 people. We're talking 300 people. And they would gather the religious leaders from all across the world to come, travel to meet at this council, so that they were getting a large world view as they discussed things like the divinity of Christ or the Trinity. They wanted someone from Africa, someone from Asia, someone from Europe, all together. These are all Jews at the time, discussing these matters so that it wasn't so culturally focused. It wasn't just the culture of Europe or the culture of Asia deciding what is the Trinity, but we had high priests and religious leaders from all over the world coming together to debate it. So I would answer that question. I mean, we had the best people at the time to be talking about this stuff. It wasn't just Joe Schmo and his kids, it was the most renowned people at the time that were traveling to meet together to debate these things. And these councils were a debate, which is why they lasted so many years, is that they were heavily disputing these ideas and how we interpret the writings of Paul and the writings of the disciples who traveled with Jesus and so on and so forth.
I think the book was the Da Vinci Code. Because I don't know what it has to do.
I have not read the Da Vinci Code, so... Dan Brown, Angels and Demons. Have you read that?
No, but like I said, these are the things that non-Christians sometimes pop up to you, and it's just like, wait a minute.
Those are fiction.
They are.
I think an answer to that might be the non-contradictory nature of the Bible. The end product supports the fact that it was divinely inspired through these councils throughout history.
Yes, and I think as we debate these things or as we talk about these things, that is something that's really important to remember, is that the Holy Spirit did have a role in the forming of the canon, in these councils meeting. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Are these based on the actual Word of God, or are they just like a historical account?
Well, there is more than just the historical account in Genesis through Deuteronomy. Like, Genesis is full of historical accounts. Same with Numbers, as the people traveled through the desert. But in like Deuteronomy, Moses recaps, the story. Well, the Torah very much is historical. Yes. Sorry, what was your question again?
If they had based it or written it on the actual Word of God, or was it from the Word of God, or was it based on a historical event, that they witnessed? Yeah,
so Ezra compiled the Torah from the writings of Moses. And, Moses writes the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Ezra puts them together. Every single Torah that has ever been produced is a copy of that scroll that Ezra put together. So, yes, even this one, even made in 1800, is an exact copy, or 98% accurate to the scroll that Ezra put together. So you're bringing up a great point, something I want to talk about. The Hebrew Bible that we have right now, the oldest dated Hebrew Bible that we have is referred to as the Masoretic text, which dates to 1010 AD. Very late in time, right? 1010 AD. However, the findings in Qumran caves, the Dead Sea Scrolls, everything that they find that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, every piece of Old Testament literature is always, at a minimum, 97% identical to anything that sits in the Masoretic text. Now, the Masoretic text sits at 1010 AD, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are all being dated from 200 BC to 200 AD. So all the stuff that they are finding in the Qumran caves are dating 200 BC to 200 AD, and they are 97% identical to everything that is found in the Masoretic text. So that shows you that they are very devout in the copying of these manuscripts. Guys, right now in my degree, we very heavily are diving into what they refer to as textual criticism. So differences between the manuscripts, differences between the Greek papyri pieces, and differences between like the Codex Alexandrinus and the Septuagint. And I want to tell you that even though there are many textual variants in the New Testament, not any of them have anything to do with core theology. So none of them have to do with the divinity of Christ or the Trinity or God or Jesus or anything like that. When we're talking textual criticisms, we're talking this manuscript has and this one doesn't. This manuscript says the tree, and this one just says tree. So they are very minute, and they are not able to dispute theology when we're talking textual criticisms. And I would love to talk more about that. Or if you are reading your Bible and you encounter a footnote that says there's a textual criticism here, I would love to dive into that with you and talk to you about that. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's probably a dumb question.
No dumb questions.
Okay, so am
Sorry.
I understanding correctly that the Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament? So if you were reading it, is it like reading the Bible, or is there differences in the way it's written?
Yes. Your English Bible, Genesis, the first 5 books of it, Genesis through Deuteronomy, are basically a word-for-word translation of this scroll. So yes, this is the first 5 books of the Bible. If we were to roll this all the way to the far of that end, it starts with, in the beginning, God created. Just like you find in the intro to Genesis.
That's what I wanted to make sure it wasn't just like a summary.
Yeah, it's not a summary like the Message or anything like that. It is word for word, first 5 books of the Old Testament. Yeah, Genesis through Deuteronomy in Hebrew.
As far as in, like you said you could see the Torah in a museum and that. As far as old copies, you said this is from the 1800s. How old copies do they have that you can see? Do you know how old? I just kind of
Yeah, that's a great question.
just out of curiosity.
The oldest pieces of the Torah are coming out of the Qumran caves or the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I wish I had an exact date on like the oldest Torah that we have on the planet. I imagine it would be in that museum in Israel, the Bible Museum that's...
I wondered if there's a lot of these for the 1800s, because it's just...
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I've never seen it.
I will tell you, there are tons of them from the 1800s and the 1900s. And when I worked at Manuscript Research Group, I mean, we had Torahs ranging anywhere from 1,000 to 2020, okay? And obviously, the older we get, the higher chance there was of it being destroyed. But yeah, there are Torahs definitely at least back to 1,000 AD. So I don't know that exact number. You could probably find that if you just Googled that. Through my process at Manuscript Research Group, what I did there was I looked at Torahs all day long. I would do an analysis of a Torah. And the main thing I would do is I would look at the way a letter was written or the orthography. And that would help me identify which part of the world it came from and the date of it. So to put it in English terms, in the 1800s, they wrote A's different than they write A's modernly now in 2025. So even if we're talking about the way an A is written in Michigan, in northern Michigan, they wrote A's differently in 1800s that we are writing A's in 2025. And they may have wrote A's differently in northern Michigan that they did in Ohio. So that was my work at Manuscript Research Group. And the certain letters that appear in this Torah, they were only writing them in the early 1800s, which is how, and so some of the ways that I saw that, there's a letter in Hebrew called Pei, and it's translated into P in English. And it kind of looks like a swirl almost, like an infinity sign. And in the earlier 1800s, they would write what are called rolled pays, where they would swirl this thing as much as they could. And they stopped doing that because they wanted biblical manuscripts to have like legit letters, so to speak, and not embellish the letters. So they stopped doing that around 1820, all across the board. So that was one way that I was able to say that it was pre-1820. And because of the red dyed face on some of these panels you see, it was evident that it was from Yemen. I was also told it was from Yemen, but that stuff like that. You know, there are little minute things that help you narrow it down to here and here. And once you find enough of those minute things, all those arrows point to and lock it into one time. So, you know, labeled this at 1800 to 1820, and then I would just say like 1810 because it sits right in the middle. So stuff like that. It was a process, and there was a lot of training, and I looked at a lot of Torahs. It would take me about a month going 9 to 5, 8 hours a day, Monday through Friday, 40 hours a week. It would take me about a month to go through a Torah that was Gavil, the full hide, and it would take me about a week to go through a Torah that was written on the cloth. Reason why is that the ink bleeds out a lot more on this Gavil hide. So as they would like write a letter, the ink would then like seep out, and it would seep into other letters. Now, one of the laws about writing biblical manuscripts is no two letters can touch. So they would then have to stop working and go through and cut apart the two letters once the ink dried, and that would be referred to as a letter separation. And I had to document every single letter separation that I encountered as I was going through Torahs. That didn't happen as much on the cloth, the more paper-like, although it still is skin. So there are all kinds of ways and all kinds of training that I went through to help me identify that the way that they are writing this Hebrew, they only did that in Judaic schools in Northern Europe between 1800 and 1850, and so on and so forth, encountering rolled pays, encountering all kinds of things like that. Yeah, the languages themselves constantly evolve, and the way languages are written constantly evolve. Even if we just look at Old English into current English. You know, the English language has evolved just in the last 200 years. From the way that they were writing Old English in Europe was different than the way they were writing Old English in other parts of the world. And English itself has evolved. So as I look at the writings in English, you can give it a timeline by the way that T's are written or A's are written. And it's the same with Hebrew. So that's specific with timeline, but then there are certain types of materials that they would use which could help identify certain parts of the world. Also, the way letters are written can help identify parts of the world as well. But all these things, you put all these pieces together like a puzzle, and you're left with a certain time range from a certain part of the world. And we would always leave it at that. We wouldn't get super specific with this is 1807, you know. Whatever time range we landed on, we would say. So if we had to say a Torah was written 1800 to 1805 from Northern Europe, we would just leave it at that. Yeah. So I was very lucky to get as close to even saying that this is from Yemen, even to put it at one whole country, you know. That's still pretty small piece of the world, you know. Good question. I can do my best. So this doesn't have any vowels, so it's very difficult. I've been studying Hebrew since 2018 and struggle with it when it has vowels. So my Hebrew Bible, which is on the right of the Torah, as you came up, you saw, I can read that and pronounce that for you. I can't translate it on the fly. But my biblical knowledge in English helps a lot. So if I'm looking at Genesis 1, I know what Genesis 1 says. So as I'm reading it in Hebrew and pairing it with the vocab that I'm having to memorize, I can get through it. I'm a lot better with Greek, though. I've spent a lot more time with the Greek language. I've been studying Greek since 2018 as well. But I really like Greek. Greek is a lot easier of a language to deal with because it's a lot newer of a language. So as language itself evolved, grammatical rules evolved. Hebrew is one of the first literate languages. We went from Egyptian hieroglyphs, pictures, to Paleo-Hebrew, which is like pictures written in sentences to try to say something, into Biblical Hebrew. So it's a very, very old language, which means that there's not a lot of grammatical rules, which makes it very, very hard to read and to translate. But Greek is much later evolved of a language, still evolving. I mean, Greek is still a language today, being spoken in Greek, and so is Hebrew in Israel, but usually Hebrew is only being spoken in Israel in a religious setting. And Hebrew was a dead language for many, many years until Israel was reinstated as a nation. That's when Hebrew as a language went from dead language to a live language again. So languages that are no longer being spoken or taught are referred to as dead languages, such as Latin. Latin is considered a dead language because there is not a single country that identifies Latin as their mother tongue right now. So when Israel was not a nation, there was not a single country that was using Hebrew as their mother tongue language. And still probably in Israel, it's still probably Arabic right now. But the Jewish community is still using Hebrew in religious settings. So Hebrew went from dead language to back alive again in 1948 when Israel was reinstated as a nation. But Greek has been an alive language the whole time. Greek never went into a state of being a dead language. And since it became a language much later in life, it has a lot more grammatical rules, so it's a lot easier to read and translate. Did that answer your question? Great, good question. Go ahead, Rick. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So are there these letter scrolls all over the world that you read from, or they just grab your Hebrew Bible and read from that?
Yeah, so much like when you walk into a church and they're handing out Bibles as you walk into a synagogue, they're handing out Hebrew Bibles for you to look at. But instead of a pulpit in a synagogue, they have basically an ark-looking type thing. And inside that is their Torahs. And they have more than one. Every single synagogue has more than one Torah, just in case the Torah that they are using becomes kosher or takes damage, they have another one. So most synagogues have 3 to 5 Torahs. They also have the 7 festival scrolls, which I didn't even talk about. The Scroll of Esther is read every single year at the Feast of Purim. And the Esther Scroll is one of 7 scrolls that are paired with the 7 festivals that we find in the Old Testament that the Jewish people are called to worship. So every single synagogue doesn't just have 3 to 5 Torahs. They have 3 to 5 of the 7 festival scrolls. They also have those haftarahs, which is the rest of the Old Testament, and they have 3 to 5 of those. Just in case any one of them enters into a state of pasul, they have another one. And all of those biblical manuscripts are kept in that ark-type looking thing. Some synagogues even have an ark behind like a veil, like they've recreated a Holy of Holies type looking thing. And so you can open, the scribe himself, or whoever's going to do the reading, opens the veil, opens the ark, and pulls out a Torah, along with a haftarah, and if it's a festival, one of the festival scrolls, and reads from it, and then the congregation members read from a Hebrew Bible. So, yes to both. Cool, go ahead.
Is there any record or documentation or markings on each scroll that might indicate who the scribe was?
That's a good question. Not on biblical manuscripts. On something like I passed around, yes. And we have seen that on Greek manuscripts written on papyrus. But something that's interesting to talk about is that any papyri, Greek manuscript, is not written by a Jew or the Jewish community. The Old Testament's Hebrew scrolls are written by Jewish community, and they were very rigorously copied these perfectly from a former copy. So when a scribe is writing a Torah, he has another Torah in front of him that he's copying. And he is not allowed to add or take away a word from that. And before a scroll is deemed kosher, it's checked by 2 other scribes that did not write the Torah. So the one guy writes it, he hands it to another scribe who verifies. Yes, there are many, many lines of control in the Jewish community for the Hebrew scrolls or Old Testament scrolls. But when we start looking at New Testament papyrus pieces, yes, we do see stuff written in the columns that the scribe wasn't sure, because when the New Testament was being mass produced, we had one guy standing in front of a bunch of others, and he would read it aloud. He would not pass it around for them to copy. He would read it aloud, and then everyone in the room would write it down. Now, what's interesting about Greek is you have 16 different ways to say Jesus loved John. Okay? So you have 16 different scribes all writing it in a different way. Some of them are writing John was loved by Jesus. Some are writing John. So word order is irrelevant in Greek. In English, word order is so important. You know, we start with the subject. I went to the mall. So subject, verb, direct object in English. Greek isn't like that. The words are all over the board. And the way the word is spelled tells you if it's the subject or the direct object or the verb. So when a guy says Jesus loved John, you have it written 16 different ways because those 3 words could be put in any way, thus textual variance. You see where I'm going with that? So half the room writes John first, then the word loved, then Jesus. The other half of the room writes Jesus, then the word loved, then John. And whichever one they're putting first is which one they wanted to emphasize. So some of them wanted to emphasize the fact that John is receiving love from Jesus. Others wanted to emphasize the fact that Jesus is speaking to John, right? But it doesn't matter. The phrase, whichever way we encountered it in Greek, it's still translated in English. Jesus loved John, because English is so specific with word order, but it's not that way with Greek. So, and it wasn't being copied verbatim from a manuscript, it was being orally spoken and written down. So then we had the scribes writing in the columns like, yes, and there's 3 different words that we see in the New Testament for love in Greek. There's the love of God, there's the love of a spouse, and there's the love of a brother. Yeah, good point. Okay, seems like, another question?
Yeah.
You're fine.
So are all Torahs written in Hebrew?
Yes,
And why is it that they didn't put vowels in that?
that's a great question. I think as you saw as I passed around this manuscript, it gets pretty cluttered with all those vowels. And they were handwriting the biblical manuscripts with a feather and ink. And it would be a lot to try to write vowels in between all these lines. The ink would probably bleed out. When they're trying to write just a little dot or a little T-looking thing, it would bleed out probably. But also, in the Jewish community, once you're 8 years old, you're supposed to be able to read Hebrew without vowels. So by the time, So an 8-year-old is a Jewish 8-year-old, once they hit 9, they're supposed to be able to read Hebrew without vowels. That is extremely difficult. I mean, I've studied Hebrew for 7 years now and could not get through it without vowels. But yeah, so by the time that they got to their bar or bat mitzvah at 13, which is where, so remember I talked about the calendar and the synagogues all going through the Torahs at the same time. Any child that is born in that week, that passage of the Old Testament, that passage of the Torah is assigned to them, and that is the passage that they read during their bar or bat mitzvah. Very interesting. So by the time that they're 13, they've had 5 years of reading Hebrew with no vowels, and then they have to memorize the passage that was being read during that Sabbath when they were born, and they have to cant it or sing it. Very, very interestingly, I wanted to know what my passage of the Torah was, and my passage of the Torah is Genesis 16, Jacob and Esau, twins. Now, I am an identical twin. Very interesting, right? And Jacob is the second-born twin. I am the second-born twin. And like, how cool is that? That like, my passage of the Torah is about twins and how the second-born twin goes on and, does his work for the Lord. I deeply related to it when I found out about that. You can just Google it. You can just Google, how do I find my Torah passage? And it'll take you to a link where you have to input your birthday into a Jewish calendar, which is different than the Roman calendar that we all use. And it will give you your Torah passage. It will give you your Haftarah passage. So there's a passage of the first 5 books of the Old Testament paired with you, and there's a passage of the rest of the Old Testament that's paired with you depending on the day that you were born. And that's also specific to the year that you're born. So you got to put in your whole birthday. But yeah, you can just, the internet, it's a wonderful thing. Cool. Well, I think that's one more question. Yes. Yes, sorry. Should have left that up the whole time. Any more questions? Well, go ahead.
Between the time of the resurrection and the decision to do Torahs, there was quite a bit of time space between that. And how was that determined?
So Torahs were being written long before Jesus even hit the earth. Okay? Jesus opens a scroll of Isaiah when he goes into a synagogue during his ministry and reads from Isaiah 61, which shows us that that synagogue at that time had a scroll of Isaiah. If they had a scroll of Isaiah, they definitely had a Torah. Okay? So remember that the Torah was put together during the time of Ezra, which is roughly 300, 400-ish years before Christ even hit the earth. Okay? But to answer your question about the compiling of the New Testament, maybe, you said how did they go about that? Was that the question?
How was that determined? I mean, did they have a council that said, we need to do this and this?
Yeah, so it was those councils that met, like the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Carthage and stuff. There was lots of biblical literature, or literature that was written by people that knew Jesus, or literature that was written by people who traveled with Jesus, such as Paul writes a bunch of literature. Paul, one of the guys who was in Paul's gang or posse, Barnabas, writes a bunch of literature. All these people are writing literature. There's all this literature circling around about Jesus Christ, and these councils met together to determine, like, we want to make a book about Jesus. We want to put this literature together into a book, and which of the literature are we going to call divinely inspired? Which of the literature are we going to call canon? And that's what those councils decided, was which of these literatures and these letters and these things that are circulating are we going to put together to form a book about Jesus Christ, hence the New Testament. And it did not become finalized until the Synod of Jerusalem, which was in 1672. Yeah, so not that long ago. I mean, we're talking 700 years ago. So not that long. I mean, it took a long time for them to discuss these things and finalize these things. Yeah, exactly. That was part of these councils meeting. It was bring any manuscripts you have about Jesus to the council. And we want to put it all together, and we want to read it all, and we want to debate it all and discuss it all.
Why are Torah still being reproduced today?
Because there's still Jews today that don't believe in Jesus. So they don't care about the New Testament. They're continuing with the traditions of the Old Testament and continuing with worshiping God in the ways that Jews always have from Mount Sinai, when Moses climbed up Mount Sinai. Yeah, good question. Okay, well, hey guys, it has been truly an honor. Thank you so much for giving me your time and attention. I hope you were inspired, and I hope you learned something. Thanks. Thank you.